Oh, I'm on. Hi. Thank y'all for coming today. Hi. Okay, so I'll get started, and this first lecture. So basically, these lectures are conceived as a lead up to Christmas. So in this first lecture, I'm going to introduce the Virgin Mary and all of the narratives that have been told about her in terms of art and art history. And then the next lecture will be the Annunciation. And then the last lecture will be largely about John the Baptist. So you'll have a repeat on John the Baptist on the last lecture. But anyway, in this lecture, I'm going to introduce the Virgin Mary. Who was she? We have very little to go on in the Bible. From Matthew, we have only this. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. From Mark, there's nothing. From John, there's nothing. And from Luke, the book in the Bible that describes the Virgin in the most detail, we get only this. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, she's the mother of John the Baptist, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." And that's it. I chose this painting to start our study today because it captures the mystery that surrounds Mary. We assume the mother of Christ to be beautiful, young, and innocent. Yet, the Bible doesn't say any of this. And so numerous legends have sprouted up about her and then were illustrated by artists throughout history. This painting is by British artist Arthur Hacker, and it derives from a piece of writing from the 2nd century called the Infancy Gospel of James, or the Proto-Evangelium of James, which describes Mary receiving the Annunciation from an invisible angel while gathering water from a well. In fact, almost all of the information that we have about Mary comes from extra-biblical sources. So a couple of pieces of iconography that I want to show you is in the back of the picture, you have a plant growing. It's called milk thistle, or Sibyllum Marianum, or St. Mary's thistle. It's covered in thorns, which of course is referencing to the crucifixion, and it has a milky sap, which references Mary as the mother of Jesus. So I'm having to use two different, oh, good, it worked. From the very beginning of the Christian church, we have wanted to know more about Mary and her family. And certainly artists have wanted to tell this story. So let's start with Mary's mother and father, Anne and Joachim. Who's ever heard of St. Anne? Yes. Well, she's not in the Bible. And we'll get to that in a minute. This fresco is part of a cycle depicting the life of Mary in the Cappella Tornabuoni in Santa Maria Novella in Florence. The chapel was commissioned by the Tornabuoni family in the 1480s at the height of the Italian Renaissance by one of the most important painters working at that time, Domenico Ghirlandaio. He had a large workshop in Florence and was, in fact, Leonardo da Vinci's teacher. The narration of the story of Mary starts at the entrance to the chapel with the expulsion of Joachim from the temple, and that's what we're looking at here. The setting is very typical of Italian Renaissance painting. You've got the round arches, the polychrome marble, symmetry, and the vanishing point perspective that were so important for the Florentine Renaissance, which was preoccupied in making 2D space seem real. In the lower left corner, we see Florentine gentlemen, including the client's son, Lorenzo, and his friend Piero, who was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. In the group on the right lower corner, Ghirlandaio depicts famous contemporary artists, including himself. In the background, we see famous Florentine buildings. For example, the Spedale degli Innocenti, which was the founding hospital in Florence, designed by Brunelleschi, as well as other Renaissance-style palaces. So the Spedale is the pink building that goes along the back. And you can still see it today in Florence. In the center of the loggia, a high priest is receiving sacrificial lambs at the altar where a fire is burning. Since the old Joachim, who is the father of Mary, Saint of Mary the Virgin, since the old Joachim does not yet have any descendants, he is not allowed to take part in the sacrificial rite and is sent away. So you can see him on the right, and he's got his lamb in his arms, and he's being sent away from the altar, and he's looking back at it. Okay, where does Ghirlandaio get this story? In the 13th century, a Dominican monk named Jacopo de Varazze, or Jacobus de Voragine in Latin, compiled a book called The Golden Legend, which was one of the most influential books of the late Middle Ages. It was a compilation of the saints' lives and liturgical instruction. And he utilized a wide range of source material, and it was intended as a source book for clergy in need of material for their sermons. I think I just saw Reagan come in here. Oh, there you are. If you need some material. Anyway, well, it became a bestseller, and we now have over 1,000 manuscripts in the Latin and over 500 translations into common languages. Jacobus was a Dominican, and the Dominicans are a mendicant order of friars, meaning they dedicate themselves to poverty, traveling, and teaching in urban areas. Jacobus eventually became the prior of the Lombard province in 1267. The Lombard province would have been northern Italy. And so he was influential. And his book traveled with the monks along various Dominican networks throughout Europe. It was nicknamed the Golden Legend because it was worth its weight in gold. The word legenda just means text to be read aloud. By the time the printing press was invented in the late 1400s, the Golden Legend was more popular than the Bible itself. So if artists were looking to Jacobus, what was Jacobus looking at? Jacobus was looking at a manuscript that didn't make it into the Bible, called the Infancy Gospel of James, or the Proto-Evangelium, which I just mentioned. We know that it already existed in the 2nd century because Origen, the early Christian scholar in Alexandria, mentions it. We have the book in the original Greek, as well as several translations of it. Additionally, scholars think it was probably written by a non-Jew because the author does not appear familiar with Jewish life or writing, which might have been one of the reasons it didn't make it into the Bible. Also, remember, the New Testament wasn't finally formulated until the late 4th century. So we're talking about a 2nd century manuscript. So what we have are all of these writings floating around that tried to fill in the gaps in the story of Jesus' birth. And there was a reason for this. Imagine that you are an early believer and you're struggling with the idea that a man is God. And the church is struggling with it too. In fact, the Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325 to once and for all define and codify Christian belief, which resulted in the Nicene Creed that we repeat every Sunday. And again, the Nicene Creed predates the final compilation of the New Testament. I don't know if, just as a sidebar, I don't know if y'all saw just in the Wall Street Journal that they have figured out the church that the Nicene Creed was born from. It's been under a lake outside of Iznik in Turkey, and because of a drought, it's kind of resurfaced. And so the Pope actually visited it, I think late last month. So anyway, you're an early believer. Questions you might have asked are, okay, so if Jesus is God, what was he like when he was a kid? Was he like other kids? Did he figure out he was God along the way? And importantly for us, how could a mortal woman be the mother of an eternal God? What would the requirements be of her? And what about her husband, Joseph? What was he like? So the problem is that the New Testament, in its final compilation, doesn't answer any of these practical and very human questions. And so clergy and artists looked back to ancient extra-biblical sources for stories to fill in the gaps. So here is how the Virgin was conceived according to the infancy gospel of James, or the Proto-Evangelium. For an angel of the Lord had come down to Joachim, saying, Joachim, Joachim, the Lord God has heard your prayer. Go down from here. Look, your wife has conceived in her womb. Immediately Joachim went down and called the shepherds, telling them, bring 10 lambs without spot or blemish here to me. The 10 lambs will be for the Lord God. This is the scene that Lucas Cranach, the elder, painted here. Cranach was a German Renaissance painter from Saxony in the 16th century. He was from a family of artists and became the most important of them. In 1505, Cranach became the court painter in Wittenberg, actually becoming the mayor of Wittenberg in 1537. He was in Wittenberg at the same time that Martin Luther was, and in fact, they became friends. Cranach ran a large workshop and was very fast and prolific, becoming famous for his portraits and especially female nudes. And it's a lot easier to paint Eve over and over again as a nude than it is to paint anybody else, particularly the Virgin. The next scene is one of the most frequently represented in the life of Mary, and it also occurs in the infancy gospel of James and in the Golden Legend. It is about Anna, who, like Joachim, is not in the Bible. The story is that at the same time that the angel is speaking to Joachim, again, above my pay grade, this is what we should be looking at. So, the story is that at the same time that the angel is speaking to Joachim, 2 angels speak to her. They tell her not to worry about Joachim getting thrown out of the temple and retreating into the wilderness, but to go down to meet him at the Golden Gate in Jerusalem. The scene developed into the kiss at the Golden Gate. Anna, who was past the age of childbearing, becomes pregnant with Mary. The miracle of Anna's late life pregnancy is thus a sign of the coming virgin birth. This parallels other biblical stories about women past childbearing age becoming pregnant, such as Sarah's pregnancy with Isaac, Hannah's pregnancy with Samuel, and most importantly for our story, Elizabeth's pregnancy with John the Baptist. The visual idea that Mary was conceived with a kiss helps illustrate the Catholic doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, wherein Mary was conceived without the stain of original sin by the grace of God. She had already been absolved of human sin back in the 5th century by St. Augustine. So this was a real concern of scholars and new members of the church. This belief had been argued about from the Middle Ages and was finally turned into Catholic dogma by Pope Pius IX in 1854 because it solves the logical problem of a mortal woman born under original sin becoming the mother of an eternal, sinless God. So this piece is by Giotto di Bondone, and if you come to the pilgrimage, we're going to go see this piece. It's at the Arena Chapel. Giotto is a Florentine painter and architect, and is considered the most important artist of the 14th century. He had a huge impact on other later Renaissance artists, such as Raphael and Michelangelo. His most famous project was the frescoes in the Arena Chapel in Padua, which depict scenes from the lives of St. Joachim and St. Anne and the Virgin, as well as the life and passion of Christ. He developed a new, simple style that focused on realistic bodies and expressions, and he specialized in getting to the heart of whatever episode from sacred history he was representing. So here is a scene about what happens next, but is not the birth of Jesus, obviously. We are back in the Tornabuoni Chapel with another scene from the life of Mary, also taken from the Infancy Gospel of James. Notice the reference to the kiss at the Golden Gate on the upper left. It takes place in a very fancy Renaissance-style room, and the Virgin Mary has just been born. Across the bottom of this piece is a Latin inscription that says, "Thy birth, O Virgin and Mother of God, brings joy to all the world." The daughter of the donor, Ludovica, is entering the birth room from the left. She's the one in the yellow robe. She is noticed by the kneeling nurse who turns up and looks at her, a direct link between the ancient story and the contemporary world. And as we will see, artists did this a lot, basically contemporizing ancient settings to make the stories more relevant to the viewer. Imagine Hollywood making a movie about the birth of Christ in today's setting. Further on, in both the Infancy Gospel of James and the Golden Legend, when Mary turns 3 and is weaned, her parents take her to the temple with offerings, and she climbs up the steps without help, as if she were already grown. And so you can see Mary, the little girl, climbing up the steps, and the priests are greeting her at the top of the steps. The scene self-consciously quotes the biblical narrative about the prophet Samuel being dedicated to the temple by his grateful and elderly parents. From that time, she is raised in the temple, where she devotes herself to prayer and to sewing, and she is fed by angels and nurtured by doves. This huge canvas still decorates the wall for which it was created in the Sala del Albergo of the Scuola Grande di Santa Maria della Carità in Venice, which now forms part of the Accademia Museum. And in the lower corner, I have a picture of what it looks like today. In fact, Jerusalem here looks a lot like Venice. And that makes sense because it was painted by Titian, who was the greatest painter of 16th century Venice and the first painter to have a mainly international clientele. In terms of Renaissance art, he is put in the same category with Michelangelo and with Raphael. But one thing I want to point out here, Mary is almost always dressed in blue, symbolizing her as the Queen of Heaven. From ancient times, blue and purple dye were the most expensive. Called Tyrian purple or royal blue, the dye came from crushed murex shells, and they made the city of Tyre on the Phoenician coast famous. And so there was an association with honor from pre-Christian times. In fact, the ancient Romans, if you were of the senatorial class, you could wear Tyrian purple, but if you were beneath that class, you could not. Later, blue paint was made from crushed lapis lazuli, also a very expensive paint. And the person commissioning the picture would have to pay for the blue paint up front. And so you might use your most expensive paint to honor the Virgin. Mary's childhood in the temple is also a subject of interest to artists. This was a subject particularly popular in Italian and Spanish paintings of the 17th century, with the Virgin serving as a model to emulate. Here we see several attributes of Mary, which will repeat over and over. For example, the vase on the right has in it roses and lilies. The lily symbolizes purity, innocence, and immortality. Mary has often been called a rose without thorns, since the Catholics believed that she was free from original sin. This may refer to the writings of Ambrose, who, as the 4th century bishop of Milan, wrote that a thornless rose grew in the Garden of Eden, and after the fall, it developed thorns as a reminder of human sin. But its scent and its beauty reminds the center of life's lost paradise. Thus, we have the rosary dedicated to prayers to the Virgin, as well as rose windows, which were also dedicated to the Virgin in church architecture. She's also sewing, as the Golden Legend says that her job in the temple was sewing at the temple veil. And she has a holy book, which she has been reading. A sewing basket and a book also become attributes. So when you read the Proto-Evangelium, you realize that the overarching focus is on Mary's purity, in an attempt to point out that of all the virgins of Israel, Mary was indeed extraordinary. A miraculous birth, raised in utter purity in the temple, until, of course, she hits puberty. Leviticus 15 makes it very clear that a menstruating female could not be allowed to live in the temple. And so she needs to be betrothed so that she can live elsewhere. So according to the Proto-Evangelium, the chief priest Zacharias orders all the unmarried men of Judea to bring their staffs with them to the temple, and he would pray over them, hoping for a sign from God about who should become Mary's husband. Joseph is an old widower by this point, but the priest compels him to bring his staff anyway. Well, guess whose staff miraculously sprouts? Oh, it didn't work. Well, I can tell you it's Joseph's staff. And if you were looking at the figure in yellow, he's holding a staff, and at the very top of the staff is like just a little sprout. So Joseph's staff sprouts. And on top of that, according to the story, a dove comes and sits on his head. So there was no denying that he was meant to be Mary's husband. This painting comes out of this story, and it's called The Marriage of the Virgin. And so anytime you see this, The Marriage of the Virgin, this is the story it's quoting. And of course, it's not described in the Bible at all. This painting is one of the most famous examples of the story. It's by Raphael, and he painted it when he was 21 years old. Raphael was an Italian painter and architect of the High Renaissance, and his work is admired for its clarity of form and composition. And together with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, he formed the traditional trinity of the great masters of the High Renaissance. Raphael was enormously productive, running a large workshop, and despite his death at 37, leaving a large body of work. His most famous group of paintings are in the Raphael rooms in the Vatican Palace, particularly a painting called The School of Athens. And you can see that there's a lot of similarity between this painting, painted early in his career, with the School of Athens that was at the aegis of his career, the top. So as you can see from the very beginning, there was a concern with the identity of Mary, even if it's not in the Bible. And all of this narrative about Mary's grand and unusual childhood belie the biblical story, which focuses on God's providence in choosing Mary, a lowly girl from a small town. And so today, we have a few questions for you about Mary and things to consider. Why would the early Christians have been so concerned about Mary's purity? How does Mary's virginity matter in redemption history? And why would somebody believe that Mary needs to be unaffected by original sin to be the mother of Jesus? And that's it for today.